Welcome to another recorded lecture in the course Literature and Identity in the Middle East. I'm Dr. Nikolsky and I'm the teacher and coordinator of this course. The first part of the course is dedicated to learning an analytic method called textual theory, which we then use to analyze literature of the Middle East. We will follow the introductory book describing this theory called Textual Theory and Introduction, written by Joanna Gavins. And we will then use this approach to analyze short stories from the book Gaza Writes Back, which was compiled by Rifat Al-Arir, and you can find links to these two books in the description below. The second part of the course will focus on identity issues which are particular to Palestinian society. Today I talk about chapter 7 of the book Textual Theory Introduction by Joanna Gavins. The chapter is titled Distances. This chapter is the last of the group of 3 chapters titled Layers, chapter 5, Attitude, chapter 6, and Distances, this chapter. These 3 chapters are dedicated to 3 ways in which the author, through the text, is manipulating, in a positive sense, the mind of the reader or the hearer in creating a text world in their mind in ways which are implicit. So I will first look at chapter 7, Distances. Then, as usual, I will analyze stories from Gaza Writes Back, and I will end with your assignment for this week. Today we will review the last chapter in a series of 3 that focus on the type of text world that is created in the split discourse world or in the text world, and on the effect the type of text world created has on the teller-audience or reader relationship. These are text worlds that are not in the here and now of the scene, but depict not only what is in the mind of the enactor, but also the enactor attitudes or control of the text world. In chapter 5, we learned how an enactor in the split discourse world controls access the reader has to the information by presenting this information as belonging also to the cultural knowledge of the reader or listener, or as something that was intimated to the enactor only, who is now telling us about this. Gavins analyzes the example of the book of the baby whisperer with regard to this. In chapter 6, we learned about 2 basic attitudes, I would even say emotional attitudes: boulomaic, when the content of the text world is desired, or desired and then negated, and deontic, in which the content of the text world has to do with what the enactor experiences as obligation or prohibition. With regard to the former, Gavins analyzed a discourse about the dream wedding of a British pop singer, and with regard to the latter, an instruction book for Volkswagen's owners. Today's chapter is called Distances, and it talks about epistemic text worlds. Well, chapter 7 talks about distances. To quote Gavins, the discussion here concentrates on the articulation of knowledge and belief through language and the process by which such abstract concepts are conceptually managed. Epistemology, from the Greek word episteme, has to do with knowledge. The texts Gavins analyzes in the book are those of politicians or journalists, one from a 2006 Radio 4 discussion with a few panelists, and the other of a political speech. So what are the signs in the text that a text world which an actor is creating is an epistemic one? Epistemic modality happens when someone expresses their knowledge or belief. This can be on a spectrum of belief from absolute certainty at one end of the scale to a complete lack of confidence at the other. This is from Gavins, page 110. Here are some words that transfer us to an epistemic modulated world. Suppose, believe, know, think, or doubt. Or epistemic modal adverbs, such as doubtfully, supposedly, perhaps, maybe, possibly, certainly. The structure of be to or be that as a stepping stone to an epistemic commitment, the structure which we saw regarding the Boulomaic and deontic world switches is found here as well. They are unlikely to turn up, or it is doubtful that I will pass the test. The epistemic modality is in a way inherent in any storytelling, as the teller, an actor in any communication, is parting with information, and because of the human tendency to cooperate with good intention in a discourse world. If you remember the example from the first lesson of the miscommunication and then correcting regarding the chicken sandwich, the first tendency is to trust the person who is telling us something, unless something is there that makes us divert from this tendency. What can make us divert differs according to person and mainly to social condition. Some societies don't trust strangers, some don't trust the regime, and some don't trust lower classes. Similarly, when an implied author begins their story, they don't say, I think that once upon a time Little Red Riding Hood went to visit her grandmother. They just straight away start telling, and this is the imparting of information in which we trust. In these cases, the epistemic modality is implied, not openly expressed. The sandwich worker did not say, I will tell you now what I surely know about Wisconsin. It is the dairy state of the US. The speech is not like this, it's spontaneously produced, and the level of reliability depends on the interpersonal interaction. We saw this with the baby whisperer case, where the author created reliability when playing between discourse world, split discourse world, and the text world. Epistemic modality on the textual level is the transfer into an epistemic text world, that is, a text with a level of knowledge designated to it. The type and level of knowledge is openly expressed, is openly told by all these words that I mentioned earlier. The text worlds created by all forms of epistemic modality differ from deontic and Boulomaic model worlds in one crucial respect, says Joanna Gavins on page 112. While all model worlds contain situations which are in one way or another remote from their original world, epistemic modal worlds often have an added layer of unreality attached to them. How is this? Where deontic modality conveys obligation and Boulomaic modality expresses desire, epistemic modality communicates the level of the speaker's or writer's knowledge about the truth of a particular proposition. So, with deontic and Boulomaic world switches, we witness what the teller testifies about themselves. It is their attitude to the textual which is important. So we have to accept their testimony about it. However, as the level of knowledge in epistemic world switches can vary from fully verifiable certainty to complete insecurity and doubt, it is up to us, to the reader, to assess consciously the truth level of the proposition. When an epistemic modal item is created, using the words that we talked about, I know, I think, I believe, attention is drawn to the fact that this proposition is only a mental construction in someone's mind. and that a different state of affairs could have been realized in the real world. This forces the reader or listener to critique and make a decision for themselves about the truth level of this information. The reader is, of course, influenced by the level of confidence the teller exhibits with regard to the information they impart, and this depends on the closeness of the teller to the co participant in the discourse world, as we saw in chapter 5 when we talked about layers with the case of the baby whisperer. We know the person from the real world, and then this is how they make themselves reliable, and they manipulate us to believe anything else that they're saying. When assessing the epistemic position of a text world, it is useful to consider other possible modal words that could have been used. Let's say, what would we think about it if the person said, I'm certain, instead of I think? The text Gavin uses in her book as an example of an epistemic text world comes from a radio program of questions and answers with a panel of expert or public people. This is the program Any Question on the BBC channel Radio 4. The famous moderator was David Dimbleby, and the respondent was a well-known author and journalist, Simon Jenkins. The question Jenkins was asked back in 2006 when this program was aired was about a recent revelation that the Home Secretary, Charles Clarke, had presided over the release of hundreds of foreign criminals into the community who should have been considered for immediate deportation from the UK. The question was whether Clarke should resign. Jenkins says, and I'm cutting the text short,
I think that there are many of my colleagues and possibly many people here who'd love that. But I think that simply saying whenever anything goes wrong resign, particularly when the culture of resignation now applies to people who lie or misbehave or who are idiots, but never if you're incompetent. It seems to me the much more important thing is not to have a resignation, the result of which is everybody says oh that's sorted it out, but to say why is this a mess, how do we sort this mess out, where is the incompetence, who is the best man to rescue us from it, it's very unlikely to be a new person.
We will look at the text only shortly. Jenkins promotes his opinion that the politician should not resign because it is more important to sort things out, and there's little chance that a new person will be able to do this. Jenkins reports a mental process through the use of the epistemic lexical verb to think. It is a direct thought that he delivers here, which is similar to direct speech. Yeah, it has some similar qualities to it. So, like a direct speech, direct thought causes a temporal shift when occurring in the past tense. Yeah, something that thought that something had happened. But unlike direct speech, any temporal shift caused by direct thought must create a world switch. So direct speech is not necessarily a world switch, only in the past tense, but direct thought is always a world switch. A new text world outside the current scene with new world building elements of the imaginary world is created by this epistemic articulation. So these are all the cases that Jenkins create epistemic word switches. They are marked here with red and then underlined. The first of the few text world Jenkins makes is created with I think, and created through a world which is opposite to what Jenkins claims, others think. Jenkins does not really finish this sentence here, and this sentence appears after making assumptions about his colleagues who are not here to confirm or deny what he says. So this is only an actor accessible. And they, his colleagues, would like to see the resignation. He also makes an assumption about the audience, but with a very uncertain epistemic adverb, possibly. He then goes on to create a statement, also using the word I think, which is basically a list of world building elements describing the situation with regard to the resigning. Whenever everything goes wrong, it applies to people who lie, or it applies to people who misbehave. It does not apply to people who are incompetent. Yeah, the use of I think is still of a relatively weak confidence on Jenkins' part. But then Jenkins continues with it seems to me, where he moves to use a perception word, a word which refers to sensory experience, to perceive, which is a much more confident source of information in human cognition. Jenkins then ends his answer with a very confident expression when he argues that it is very unlikely that a new person will be able to resolve the problem of the home office. We see then within Jenkins' speech a build-up of his confidence as he goes along. He starts off by presenting an opinion different from others, but then he is not very secure. But when he makes his final argument that a new person will not do a better job than the existing people, he's becoming very confident. Another short example before we move to the stories from Gaza Writes Back. This one is also concerned with politics. I like this one because I could actually find part of the speech Gavins was analyzing online. But this text is important also because it looks at epistemic word switches, which are part of the hypothetical statement, part of if sentences. This is a speech by Neil Kinnock, who was then, in June 1983, a member of parliament for Alwyn, South Wales. And the Labour Party, of which he was a member, was on the verge of a second consecutive general election defeat at the hand of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative Party. Here is how the speech begins.
If Margaret Thatcher is re-elected as Prime Minister, I warn you. I warn you that you will have pain when healing and relief depend on payment. I warn you that you will have ignorance when talents are untended and wits are wasted, when learning is a privilege and not a right. I warn you that you will have poverty when pensions slip and benefits are whittled away by a government that won't pay in an economy that can pay.
And here is how it continues, now on YouTube.
If Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you that you will be quiet when the curfew of fear and the gibbet of unemployment makes you obedient. I warn you that you will have defence of a sort with a risk and at a price that passes all understanding. If Margaret Thatcher wins on Thursday, I warn you not to be ordinary. I warn you not to be young. I warn you not to fall ill. And I warn you not to grow old.
Henry's News at 10 with Neil Kinnock in Bridgend.
So I'm basically using here Gavin's analysis, quoting much of what she says. So the address can be seen to construct a single hypothetical situation, which is then developed throughout the course of the speech to include a great deal of word building, function advancing details, that is, verbs, actions. From this perspective, in his 1983 Discourse World, Kinnock describes how he thinks the UK will be constructed and how its citizens will be affected in the as yet unrealized event of a conservative victory in the upcoming general elections. Kinnock makes use of a number of rhetorical devices from classical rhetorics to expand his central theme: amplification, repetition, parallelism, ornamentation, and others. And I will not go into the meaning of all of these, just that he's being rhetorically very sophisticated. And all this to add weight to an otherwise a very simple argument. If the Tories win, it will be bad. The central hypothetical statement explored during the course of the speech is set out in the first clause of the opening line. If Margaret Thatcher is re-elected as Prime Minister. This clause is part of a conditional construction, if sentence, which in traditional grammar is divided into two components: the protasis and the apodosis. The protasis establishes the epistemic modal word, which has its status as an unrealized possibility. The apodosis component of the conditional phrase defines a situation which is consequent of the protasis. It normally contains the function advancing information, which takes the initial hypothetical situation to a further point or to its conclusion. This is something that will definitely happen if the protasis happens. If Margaret Thatcher wins, you will have pain. Kinnock generates an epistemic modal world in which the hypothetical situation of a conservative victory has been realized. The further advancement of the modal world begins in the immediate apodosis. I warn you. Kinnock goes on to add more and more detail to his imagined world of the conservative victory throughout the rest of the speech, with the repetition, I warn you, attached to a range of different and more comprehensive function advancing consequences. Many of the reoccurring of the I warn you are followed by a construction of an apparent future time zone. For example, you will have pain, you will have ignorance, you will have poverty, and so on. These kinds of constructions actually function as expression of extremely strong epistemic commitment. That's why it's meaningful here in this chapter, on the part of the speaker to the function advancing proposition they contain. Kinnock is communicating here his firm belief that no other kind of future is possible under Tory rule. In the end, Kinnock gives his audience 4 concluding imperatives, all in negated forms: not to be ordinary, not to be young, not to fall ill, and not to be old. Each one of these attributes must first be mentally represented before its prohibition in the hypothetical conservative victory world can be conceptualized, as we know about negations in general. These imperatives are a result of the strong epistemic commitment made throughout the speech by Kinnock. Let us now look at how the epistemic modal world switches are designated on the text world theory diagram. Gavins has only one short example in her book, and I don't absolutely agree with her analysis. So I will show my analysis and not the one from the book, which I usually use in this section of the lecture. Well, we have already analyzed this section of this text. So all we have to do now is to see what is happening in the diagram. And so as you see, we note the epistemic word switch with the letters EPS. And we have here all of Junkin's world switches. The first one, I think, when he refers to many of his colleagues and possibly many of the people of the audience, these are World Switch 1 about his colleagues loving resignation, and World Switch 2, possibly the people here also love resignation. Then we have the one in red, I think in red, this is World Switch 3, also epistemic, where he thinks something which is unfinished. As you remember, he was only making world building elements, but didn't make any processes, any function advancing processes. The next one is the fourth world switch, also epistemic, when he says, it seems to me, and then he's moving into perceptual, sensory input, which is more reliable and more acceptable as authoritative in the human cognition. And the fifth one, the gray one, World Switch 5, is a very strong epistemic commitment. It is very unlikely, he says. It is very unlikely that a new person would manage to sort everything in the home office. Yeah, so the main thing here is to see how to designate the epistemic world switch. Now we will look at some stories from Gaza Writes Back. In the last 3 lectures, we looked at 3 aspects of world switches: layers, which help conceptualize transitions between discourse world, a split discourse world, and a text world. We mainly talked about accessibility to word switches and the authority of the teller, the enactor in a discourse world, and the authority the teller, the enactor in a discourse world, can gain if they play the combination between these spaces wisely. We also talked about word switches which create text world with boulomaic and deontic commitments, conveying feelings of attraction, being moved toward a goal, desire, wanting in a positive or negative way. Negative, as you remember, means first creating the positive mental reality and then negating it. And then there was the second one, the deontic commitment, conveys the feeling of being chased into action. Think of an illustration of the policeman, or feeling obliged to act or refrain from action, with the same mental action regarding the positive or negative options, must do or must not do. Today we talked about epistemic commitments when presenting a text world of knowledge of the enactor who produces this text world. These can be introduced with a varying level of epistemic commitment, with words such as to know, to think, to assume, etc. In contrast to attitudes, which can be called emotional text worlds if you want, where the listener cannot but accept the teller's report of their emotions, as it is primarily enactor accessible, the epistemic text world call for assessment of the listener regarding the truth level of the content, and this assessment depends both on the content as well as the manner in which this content is being introduced by the enactor. Let us now check how meaningful text worlds created in the stories Gaza Writes Back create our assessment of the teller, and how actually they also connected to the question of identity. The story We Shall Return tells about a conversation between 3 Palestinian refugees on their journey when they stop for the night. The story portrays the sad situation of miscommunication between the 3, which is a result of lack of willingness or ability of the men to see reality clearly, to recognize their real situation, and as a result, the inability to cooperate and share the load of their destiny. Let us see how this message is conveyed in the story. So let's work a little bit on the story We Shall Return, on which you did your assignment last week, if I remember correctly. Here is the text.
At this moment, both Abu Nazar and Abu Ahmad wanted to say something. They exchanged looks for a while, as each of them waited for the other to say what he wanted to say. Neither wanted to tell Abu Ibrahim that it might take a little while longer than half a year before they could return to their homes.
So here there is reference to knowledge, knowledge about how long the exile from Palestine will last. We are in the situation where the three protagonists are sitting and talking. One of them expresses the idea that they will return soon, and then the two others feel obliged, even though it says they wanted to say, but they actually feel obliged to tell him that that this will not be so short. But it doesn't say that at the moment. It says that they feel obliged to tell him something. And later on in the text, as you see in the this is the deontic world switch, deontic world switch 1, and in the negative Boulomaic world switch, which should be world switch 2 here. This is a mistake on the slide. They didn't want to tell Abu Ibrahim that it might take a little while longer than half a year before they could return home. So this is a negative Boulomaic world switch about a knowledge that both of them have or believe, and Abu Ibrahim does not believe, and he does not have this knowledge. The story Will I Ever Get Out tells about a boy who was stuck in a smuggling tunnel and apparently died there. The strong emotional impact the story makes results from the gap between what we as readers understand about the boy and what he does, what he understands about himself. We understand that he was forced by his life situation to join a group of smuggler boys who mocked him and would probably not return to save him if this was at all possible. While he does not seem to be fully aware of the discrepancy between the image he has of himself and that of these smugglers. Let us see how we learn from the boy who does not understand his situation more than he does, that we understand his situation. Let us look at two instances in the story, Will I Ever Get Out? Here is the first moment.
All of a sudden, I had become the family's sole provider. I had to look for work. Any work. That, unexpectedly, did not take long, as some hissed in my ears. Come and work with me, Saeed. You'll never find a better job than digging the tunnels. But. No buts. It pays double what you will earn anywhere, said the man. And we will call you doctor, he added and grinned.
So in the first instance, you see, in the first world switch that you see here, world switch 1, the boy is making this world switch into a situation that explains that he had to work. And then when he finds the work and the man starts speaking, the man is making an epistemic world switch. This is world switch 2, and he claims that work better than digging tunnels does not exist. The boy then, in turn, makes another epistemic world switch in which he actually challenges the statement which the man made before. By saying but, he refers to the fact that a better work than digging tunnels possibly does exist. But then the man makes another epistemic world switch. This is world switch 4, in which he negates and overruns or contradicts the boy's epistemic world switch. Work better than digging tunnels does not exist. And then he gives all the reasons: it pays well, etc., etc. We will call you doctor. All these things. So we have a play between a young boy who has his knowledge and is making his statements, and this man who is overriding the boy's knowledge. With a deontic word switch made here, with a direct speech dialogue which took place in the past, the reader begins to understand that the boy is in a tunnel and the obligatory nature of his being there. That is, he had no choice. The statement with a grin, "We will call you doctor," reveals that the social circle where the boy now finds himself is very different from the ambitious one in which he grew up. When in the next passage, we are told that he gave up his studies because he could not balance them with his work, the discrepancy in the social status becomes even clearer. Later in the story, while digging a tunnel close to the sea, we have the following passage.
Once I wanted to warn against digging this close to the sea, but I refrained. Those non-medical school tunnel diggers must know better. The task sounded easy, albeit sweaty, until the sand began falling from the sky. I stayed behind at the end of the tunnel to hold the poles.
So as you see here in the diagram, there's a Boulomaic world switch, world switch 1, where the boy wants to warn the tunnel diggers not to dig so close to the sea, but he's refraining because they, the other enactors, know better, and this is the boy's epistemic world switch. The boy believes that they know better, that's why he stops himself from warning them. Well, he doesn't know, but we know that he was right, actually. He should have warned them. So this reveals to us that the boy does not really understand his situation. First, because the non-medical school tunnel diggers do not know better, as the tunnel did collapse. And this is something that the boy has envisioned to begin with. Then, the boy's identity as a nerd, if you want, a good boy, a well-educated, responsible boy, played to his disadvantage now. As while he stayed behind to hold the pole, all others, uneducated, non-responsible boys, left without trying to save our protagonist, the boy, and also never came back for him. Now for the story group work. Again, all 3 stories of the story group are relevant to the study of distances. In all 3, there is a play between accessibility to knowledge of the reader, while the protagonist, who knows less, is the one who actually conveys this information to the reader. The work on the stories of the story groups should be quite straightforward. Try looking for epistemic expressions and instances of epistemic world switches, and look at how knowledge, true or false, right or wrong, moves the plotline. For your assignment, work on the story Neverland by Tasmin Hamouda. Look for instances that refer to knowledge and at world switches that express their protagonist's attitude to it. Write your findings in up to 200 words and submit your assignment in the assignment link found below this lecture. The date and time of submission are indicated on the learning platform. Thank you for listening and see you next time.